And we saw the same thing earlier this month with the tragedy in the mine, the Massey Energy. After endless violations, 515 violations in 2009, 124 already in 2010, and yet they were able to fix the system by using the loopholes in the regulations to challenge the regulators and therefore not have to close the mine. And what happened? 29 miners are dead. We need to connect the dots between the mining crisis and the Wall Street crisis, because it's the same problem. Regulations in place full of loopholes that the miners and the Wall Street executives, the mining industry and the Wall Street industry know how to use all these loopholes in order to successfully continue to play the games they're playing at the expense of people's lives. So if we are really going to have accountability, it had better start now. There is no greater moment than now, when we had the mining disaster, and now yesterday the SEC challenging Goldman Sachs on fundamental grounds of fraud. What they are doing is actually exactly what Phil Angelidis described when he had some of the masters of the universe testify in front of his commission. He said, it sounds to me a little bit like selling a car with faulty brakes, then buying an insurance policy on the buyer of those cars. And that's exactly what they're doing. But let me just make something very clear. It's not going to be easy to make sure that there is finally real accountability. Everyone in this room has a responsibility to make sure that our government does not let them get away with just paying a fine, which for them is just part of just the cost of doing business, and moving on. This time there have to be criminal prosecutions. Criminal prosecutions, as the President said there may have to be when it comes to Massey Energy and the mining disaster. And there have to be criminal prosecutions when it comes to Goldman Sachs. Enough is enough. Millions of lives have been devastated because of the way the casino has been working on Wall Street. And we, the taxpayers, have been on the hook. We have bailed them out. And what did they do in return? They went back to business as usual. They curtailed lending by $100 billion, so small businesses and other businesses could not create jobs. And they are there fattening the balance sheets and paying themselves massive bonuses. Not anymore. It's not going to be easy because there are far too many people, including in the administration, whose view of the world is very Wall Street centric. In a recent interview with Rachel Maddow, Tim Geithner mentioned 3 times that the financial crisis was a failure of government. One time he called it an outrageous failure of government. The next, it was a tragic failure of government. The third, it was a terrible failure of government. But Mr. Secretary, before it was a failure of government, i.e. of regulations, wasn't it an outrageous, tragic, and terrible failure of Wall Street? And if Democrats and the administration don't use the clear, unequivocal language of accountability in dealing with what Wall Street has done, how do we expect the public to understand what is happening? We are basically simply fueling the anti-government feeling that is already out there being fueled by Republicans every day. You know, Nassim Taleb, the economist who wrote The Black Swan, put it best. He said, if people have driven a school bus blindfolded into the ditch, rule number one is do not give them another bus. Well, that's exactly what has been happening. And there is no question that the media also have a responsibility to pay here, and I include everybody in the media, mainstream, new media, all of us. And the classic case is the case of the balloon boy. Do you remember the balloon boy? Endless wall-to-wall coverage. Well, anyway, he turned out to be the attic boy rather than the balloon boy. But even leaving that aside, maybe what we need to do is create a massive balloon, and we don't even have to put them in. Just pretend we are putting in the 13 million children living in poverty in this country, and see if we can get 1% of the attention that the balloon boy got. We need to put the spotlight on people's lives and how have been affected. We need to put flesh and blood on the numbers. That's what we're doing at the Huffington Post. We have a dedicated reporter now. We are going to call him our economic suffering correspondent, but it seemed too dreary, so we're calling him our economic impact correspondent, whose job is to find the families that are dealing with the consequences of the economic devastation and tell their stories. Because that's the way to capture the public imagination and demand real fundamental change. And just look at the opportunity cost of what we have done. We have, for example, just for 2011, a budget gap across all the states of $180 billion. Now, everyone here in California knows what that means when it comes to cutting fundamental services, to firing teachers, firing policemen, eliminating healthcare opportunities for people in trouble. And yet, just remember, it was $180 billion that we gave to bail out AIG. If we had that money back, we would have had to make no cuts across all the states of the Union. And among that $180 billion, almost $13 billion went to Goldman Sachs, 100 cents to the dollar because they were a counterparty. Are you surprised that people are angry? This anger is legitimate. We need to make sure that it is funneled into the right direction. We need to make sure that it leads to real reform rather than violence. But if it doesn't lead to real reform, we are in real trouble. And that's where we come back to something that has been the truth across all American history, which is that every real change has happened because of a movement. My favorite story that illustrates that is March 1965, when Martin Luther King met with Lyndon Johnson and asked for the Voting Rights Act. And Lyndon Johnson said, we don't have the votes. And then came the Selma March. And a few months later, in August, we had the Voting Rights Act.